Welcome to the Authority File, the academic library podcast from Choice, brought to you by Sage Publishing. I'm Bill Mickey, the host of the podcast and the editorial director at Choice. For this series on the research methodologies around and library support of big data, I'm joined by Caroline Mulia, Head of Resource Sharing and Co-Associate Dean of Collections at the University of Southern California, Amy Solis, Social Sciences Data Librarian at USC, Andy Rakowski, Visualization Specialist at USC, and Ian Mulvaney, Head of Product Innovation at Sage Publishing. In this second of our 4 episodes, we continue our conversation about big data research, focusing on the library's role with not only services and instruction, but how big data impacts the collection side and how it's altering the relationships between libraries and vendors. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about big data and the library and sort of what's happening at the library, and the library's role in big data, and I imagine Caroline, Andy, and Amy, you guys can field these questions, but from a service and instruction perspective, but also from a collections perspective, talk a little bit about how USC has evolved its thinking and practice over the years.
Sure, I can start out. This is Caroline. So USC is a very big research institution, and it has, countless scholarly outputs coming from various departments and schools that are really making a global impact. So there really isn't a single mindset or practice for defining or collecting or even using big data sets, and that makes me really happy. I'm happy for that. The libraries really supports, the research, the teaching, the learning of the university, and so we're establishing our perspective, but it's also evolved over the years. So this is really to say that it continues to evolve, and I hope that that is always the case. Mm-hmm. Scholars and students, I think, are increasingly using big data sets, either in terms of volume or in terms of the questions they're posing to that data set, sort of like we were talking about earlier.
Right.
And I think the USC Libraries has organically, and dare I say, maybe even accidentally, developed their practice and perspective really based on those user needs. And so it was very sort of localized. I think that we were looking kind of conceptually for our thinking and our practice modeled after other universities and other institutions. But I think what really happened is that we went reference interview by different requests and sort of built from there. And those users are really different. So some of the users were looking to the libraries to provide large data sets that they could use to test their own homegrown computer programs or text mining platforms. Okay. And then some users were really interested in a narrow or refined set of research questions that only a single source or two could really answer for them. So maybe a textual analysis of articles about the internet that were published in the early 90s, which was a very recent request that we received. At USC, the libraries are really viewing collections as data, which, like Thomas Padilla and others have posited, I think that's really true and important to think about. And it allows us to view commodity collections, especially commodity e-resource collections, as these kind of valuable entry points for big data projects. So prior to the last few years, I'm sure we were assisting users in updating data sets, and we still continue to do that, but I don't get the sense that they would be considered kind of quote unquote big data by the definition that we're using. They were smaller, they were more discrete data sets, but I think of course it kind of contributes to the perspective that we have today and how we're operating in our practices and our thinking around that.
Okay. So yeah, you mentioned sort of the data mining projects with your e-resources. I'm wondering if you can expand on that a little bit. What were students and researchers wanting to do with those resources, and can you talk a little bit about the types of projects they were working on?
Yeah, sure. So at USC in the last 5 years or so, but I think with the steady increase in user requests over the past maybe 2 years, students and faculty alike are really knocking on the door of the libraries for support in their content mining projects and initiatives, which makes me really, really happy. Yeah. So these sort of disparate requests, I think, are what got me thinking about the role of librarians in contributing kind of to a more comprehensive plan for content mining services and instruction at the university. That, and of course, all of the libraries that are serving as models in this arena. I always look to Illinois, to Indiana, to Stanford, and to so many others to just as groups and institutions that have kind of paved the way in this thinking. So And, one of my former colleagues, Beth Namey, who is now at the Claremont Colleges, really, I'd credit her with identifying this trend at USC early on, not necessarily USC as a campus, but USC through the libraries. People started knocking on our door. And I think she was the one to really start saying, here's a trend, here's a pattern that we need to think about more, and we need to build something around. So at USC, big data and the tools that we use to explore and even analyze the data followed kind of the same trajectory. It was decentralized. People found data sets elsewhere and they built their own tools, or they found commercial tools on their own, kind of in their own departments, in their own corners of the university. So when people started coming to the libraries, I, along with some of my colleagues, got really excited for that opportunity. So we've had a lot of different requests, but I can name two that illustrate kind of the continuum of the user needs that are coming in. So one user had a very specific request that was focused on content. So he was a PhD student in art history and cinema whose work focused on stained glass windows and how they were described over time in 19th century British popular documents like newspapers. Okay. So he had a great set of research questions, but he didn't harbor any of the computer analytics skills to text mine that documentation. So he was really interested in the content, which we provided him, which was not difficult to identify. Answering that research question, we could connect the set of research questions with the resource pretty easily. But then he had to learn a bit of Python. He had to identify a platform that worked for him. I think he ended up using Buoyant. And then he was sort of on his way. And then the other example is of a user who had a specific request that was focused on volume. So this was a computer science student, and we've had a number of these kind of requests, who built his own content mining platform as part of his coursework. And he just needed a bunch of data to filter through this homegrown system to just test his work, to test the platform. So he asked for a full run of a popular newspaper, which caused some issues, I think, in terms of delivery, if I remember. But when we offered him access to another newspaper, it completely worked for him and he was on his way. So for one user, the library provided very specific content. And then for another user, the library provided a certain volume of generic content that was readily accessible. And both of those requests were fulfilled. So from a library services perspective, we did great, 2 thumbs up. And
mission
then from
accomplished.
A viewpoint, mission accomplished, we're done. We can close our door. And then from a viewpoint of learning about the diverse needs of users, we also really gained something valuable.
Okay. I wanted to go back to something you said earlier, Caroline, and you're sort of noting an interesting conversation around the role of libraries in big data research, particularly with sort of redefining users as research partners. And you were talking a little bit about this. And the role isn't just a shepherd, it's becoming more mutually beneficial, I guess, where the library helps the researcher along, but is also learning at the same time. I'm wondering if that's how you might still characterize things in terms of what you guys are doing.
Absolutely. I always strive to develop a research partnership with anyone with whom I'm collaborating. So when it comes to librarians and patrons, whether they're undergraduate patrons or, veteran faculty researchers, I think establishing that we both have a set of skills, we both have a set of resources. There's a conversation that's happening on both ends that could be beneficial and valuable in a partnership, I think is very, very important. And right. I know that Amy and Andy are doing that work all the time. I would say that there's a similar relationship that I view as a collections librarian with vendors as research partners, which for me is a very clear parallel to making sure that this work and these relationships aren't just transactional, but that there's an impact and there's a value in those relationships.
Sage Publishing has just released a new video collection on the Sage Research Methods platform called Practical Research and Academic Skills. These 400 video titles cover the practical skills needed to conduct successful research, including project and time management, writing for publication, and presenting work. There is also an essay writing kit appropriate for anyone learning to write college-level papers and information on pursuing careers in research. Students looking to continue in academia will find information on building professional networks and presenting at conferences. These tips are presented through engaging videos, which include tutorials and animated videos. Go to sagepub.com to learn more and to find information on free trials. Do you think, like, in the context of using and researching data, that sort of relationship dynamic, that collaborative dynamic, will continue for the long term, or do you feel like as you know, whether it's the library or the researcher, that as they sort of, as you guys both become more knowledgeable in using data, that you might diverge at some point, and the library will become more, I guess, established in its role and not have to collaborate as much along the way? Or do you feel like it's best and you will always collaborate and be, you know, sort of mutually finding your way along?
That's a really good question, and it's a very big question. So, which I mean, I guess it's side of
it could be a little bit mission based as well. I mean, it is your yeah.
So exactly. So I mean, taking out the kind of vendor relationship part and just thinking about the user, the library user and the librarian piece, I think that it is very mission based. And the reason I think it's such a big question is because it calls into question, or at least challenges, the role of libraries today and in the future. So I think a lot of librarians got into this work because they want to help people, right? It's more of a service industry. And for those people, I think that they're thriving, right? I think there's a real opportunity to make connections with users who need a set of resources, or even just need help kind of navigating the academic or scholarly landscape.
Right.
And then there's a whole nother set of librarians and information specialists who I think get into libraries because it's a really valuable incubator and just a neat space for experimentation and innovation. And so I would say that for that latter group, they're really pushing, I see them pushing for not just a much stronger and even collaboration, because sometimes we say collaboration and that's not really the case. The librarians sort of provide a bunch of stuff and then get very little credit for doing all of that research work, which takes skill and time and real thought. And sort of moving into a fair collaboration and a fruitful collaboration. And then even beyond that, the libraries generating that research, that scholarly output on their own, and being kind of an equal participant and equal player in that research field. That would be my ideal.
Right. Andy, Amy?
I'd like to...
Sure.
I'd just like to draw a parallel to that. So Sage are obviously a pretty large, well-established publisher, but this domain of working with data at scale, and particularly where it's moving into having an effect in social sciences and humanities, is at such an early stage that the kinds of solutions that we're going to see being needed by these communities are going to evolve fairly quickly, I think, over the next 10, 15 years. So I don't think we're going to end up anytime soon at a point where anybody feels like it's the status quo. Right. And the way we're kind of addressing that in Sage to help the evolution of this kind of topic is we've built a little innovation unit inside of Sage called Sage Ocean. That's the group that I work in. And we're taking a very collaborative approach in terms of how we develop and the solutions that we're developing. And we're trying to support researchers in making the bridge from having research projects to products that could work in market. And we're taking kind of a very lean startup approach, which involves a lot of problem discovery, customer discovery, solution discovery. And we're doing that in a very collaborative way. I think at the moment we've been focused more on the researcher, but we're very open to having conversations in the library space around these questions as well.
Okay. And then I was just going to pitch it over to Andy and Amy if there's anything you wanted to add in terms of what you're seeing, since you're right there on the front lines with the students and researchers.
I can't honestly predict what the future will be. It's all based on the research interests of faculty, and big data might not be as trendy in 10 years. I can't really predict that. I can follow along and try to keep up with the current research that's going on, and in the future maybe have a prediction, but
all right.
I wanted to add maybe one thought about that partnership model.
Absolutely.
And I think, for me, especially, I definitely, I would prefer not to, displace it, or I kind of hope that we kind of continue it. And I think one of the, I think one of the strengths of it is that this is sort of the way that we do learn about new methods that our researchers are using. Because if we just sort of, become sort of more, less working together with our researchers and kind of maybe more providing a service, or just come to me if you need to process something, then we sort of get stuck in doing that one thing and we don't understand sort of that context. And I think that the partnerships give us that context, and that's really, really important. And I think it also makes it a little bit scalable, or just a lot more scalable, especially for people like Amy and myself, who are really essentially the only people in our library kind of doing this type of work. Or we have some other people, but we're a small sort of department doing this. And by kind of making these partnerships happen rather than kind of working with everybody. I mean, we try to work with everybody, but the reality is we kind of have to scale it back. And I think partnerships allow that in a really, really meaningful way. And then the thing that I've definitely noticed is that if you do this sort of partnership model, the students and faculty that you work with, I think, are empowered to go back to their departments and teach these tools, and they become part of our community. And that's something that is sort of, that's one of these unintended kind of consequences that are really amazing, where we're building this team. So it doesn't stop with that partnership; it expands, and it sort of moves on to other places at the university.
That's an excellent point, Andy. Thank you. Caroline, real quick, I wanted to go back to something you mentioned briefly, the vendor angle here, and I'm wondering if you could share some of your experience in terms of how big data or collections data comes up in vendor meetings. Sounds like some might get it, some don't, or maybe they didn't at one point. Sometimes what might seem like a simple request from the library is very difficult on the vendor side to accommodate. At the collection level, what does USC or perhaps even other libraries need from its vendors in order to facilitate this type of research?
Sure. I think this is a great question, and perhaps it's because I'm a collections librarian and I'm biased, but maybe it's the most important question as we can really continue to deepen the kind of practical rather than conceptual conversation around big data in libraries. So libraries are not the content creators for the most part. So we really do rely on vendors and other third-party entities to provide us the content for our users, which is why I think it's so important. So what I've seen is that there's a general buzz around access to large data sets and content mining initiatives. But you're right, not every vendor is created equal in terms of their ability to deliver or fulfill requests that we're receiving from users, which again are dynamic and sometimes complex. So I'd say if you're a librarian, don't be afraid to raise these topics in vendor meetings. And if you're like me, push for some real answers. If you're a vendor, the sea change, in my opinion, is already happened. So if you're not engaging with questions of providing the resources in a different format that's amenable to something like content mining, then you're getting behind the times pretty quickly. I would say that the major pain point that I've seen at my library is that every request is slightly different. And so it takes time to figure out the needs on the library's end. So sometimes the vendor can fulfill the request and other times they can't. Sometimes it costs additional money on top of what we're already paying for the resource, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the request can be fulfilled only by sending a hard drive of data. Other times an FTP server can be set up and accessed. So these details make a really big difference, I would say, in several ways. One, strengthening the relationship between the libraries and the vendors, which could really be a strong research partnership if we let it unfold that way. Mm-hmm. And really engendering confidence in a user to be able to come to the libraries for these types of questions. So I would say that vendors need overall to get better at this piece and make it as easy for us to fulfill a content mining request as it is to buy a collection from you or to troubleshoot traditional access to a resource that we've purchased from you. Ideally, we would get to a place like that where there would be sort of a suite of whatever it is, a menu of deliverables, and we could mix and match. To an earlier point that someone mentioned, we don't really know what the future of big data holds, and that's really exciting. And so being able to sort of help us forecast that future and prepare for it, I think is really important for libraries and vendors to do together.
Right. And Ian, since you're here, I can't let that go without asking you what you think about that as well.
Yeah, so I'm going to be a little careful here because I'm so focused on trying to build tooling and support for growing skills with researchers to work with data at scale. What I can say about Sage's position on our corpus is we definitely have the opinion that if you purchased access to our corpus, that comes with text and data mining rights. And from what I understand, the way we'd like to see that work is for us to participate in broad publisher initiatives so that we're not creating bespoke endpoints. And that also should allow researchers and libraries to have a more unified way to access that data. So for us, our journal content is available through the Crossref API for download and through the RightsFind XML service. And we think that's probably the right way to go at the moment. But we recognize that we have other content that could be useful for data mining. And at the moment that requires screen scraping. And maybe that's something where we need to do some improvement on. But we were supportive of that broadly.
That was Caroline Mulia, Amy Solis, Andy Rakowski, and Ian Mulvaney. This concludes the second of our 4-part series on big data research and how libraries support it. This episode was brought to you by Sage Publishing. Be sure to join us for the next episode where we'll discuss specific big data instruction, services, and workshops that USC libraries are providing their student faculty researchers.
I've been really trying to help individually either faculty or students through understanding, the whole data lifecycle, right? So exploring their topic, what their data needs, seeing how they can gather their data and then manipulate it and hopefully disseminate it and eventually store it, right?
Find all of the episodes of The Authority File on your favorite podcast app or on our website, choice360.org. Just click on the librarianship dropdown. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.